Some guests would walk into the studio, and I'd just want to open all the windows and run away. There were smells so bad that I felt like I was sitting inside a damp, moldy storage room that hadn't been aired out for 30 years. For over 3 decades, sitting in the legendary host's chair of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson welcomed thousands of stars. His desk bore witness to every level of fame, from powerful politicians and legendary comedians to the brightest movie stars in Hollywood. However, behind the colorful lights and thunderous applause, there existed a horrifying reality that only Johnny Carson had to endure. Hollywood legends with the worst personal hygiene he had ever faced. These were icons who once made the entire world kneel at their feet, yet they had such poor body odor that Johnny Carson had to hold his breath every time he sat close to them. So who were these heavy-smelling stars? Register for the channel right now, and let's begin with the very first name, a true queen of the silver screen, Judy Garland. She smelled like desperation. To the public, Judy Garland will forever be an immortal icon. The innocent, radiant Dorothy in the magical land of Oz, the woman who moved millions of hearts with her angelic voice and bright smile. She was the queen of classic musical films and the star whom all of Hollywood worshipped at the peak of her fame. Yet, the moment she stepped out from the shadows of the stage and sat across from Johnny Carson, the legendary host nearly fainted right there in the middle of the studio. The first thing that hit his sense of smell was her overpowering, sharp breath of mint candy, a desperate attempt to cover up the strong smell of liquor and high-dose sedatives deeply embedded in her body. Her eyes were cloudy and unusually dilated from the effects of the drugs, looking at Carson as if she were trying to see through a thick layer of fog. When she tried to sing a few lines, the voice that once moved millions now came out only as hoarse, choked whispers, blocked by phlegm and a throat burned dry by years of heavy drinking. But what haunted Johnny the most was the smell of abandonment. The glamorous outfit she wore gave off a musty fabric odor, as if it had just been pulled from an old suitcase in a cheap hotel. Through the thick layer of makeup, he could also sense the cold sweat of anxiety, the smell of a soul curling up and trembling under the blinding studio lights she once craved so much. The tragedy reached its peak when Judy leaned toward Carson, her voice shaking as she begged, "Please, comfort me." At that close distance, Johnny realized clearly. Right beneath the expensive perfume was the smell of someone about to die. The smell of a life slowly fading away, even as it tried one last time to shine brightly before the world. If Judy Garland carried the scent of a flower wilting under the studio lights, then the next guest brought a completely different kind of smell. The smell of luxury that had never touched water. Angie Dickinson. She hadn't touched water in a whole month. In the 1970s, Angie Dickinson was the symbol of powerful, sensual appeal in Hollywood. With her legs praised as the most expensive in Hollywood, and her strong, seductive image in Policewoman, she was considered the standard of perfection. However, when she sat down in the leather armchair on The Tonight Show, Angie left a memory that Johnny Carson could never forget. She stepped onto the stage looking radiant and glamorous, making Johnny mentally prepare to welcome a refined lady. But instead, what hit him straight in the nose was the overwhelming smell of extremely poor hygiene. It was a strange mixture of old, fermented sweat and high-end cosmetics that had gone bad from not being washed for a long time. Even worse was the distinctive smell of a body that hadn't touched water for many days. Pungent, sticky, lifeless, yet still cleverly hidden under layers of luxurious silk. The secret behind this unpleasant body odor came from her bizarre habit. Angie was extremely lazy about bathing and doing laundry. She could wear the same set of underwear for 10 days straight, believing that her glamorous outer appearance would cover everything up. The contrast became truly horrifying every time she moved. The accumulated old sweat was heated up by the studio temperature and oozed stickily beneath her expensive fabrics. Instead of radiating the seductive charm seen on screen, every step or wave of her hand released a thick wave of air, making even the crew standing nearby cover their noses in horror. Johnny Carson once bluntly called it a sloppiness that is impossible to imagine. When Angie Dickinson left the studio, the leather armchair not only retained her body heat, but also left behind such a heavy smell that the cleaning staff had to use 5 different types of disinfectants before they dared to wipe it down. Johnny Carson thought he had experienced every horrible smell from Angie Dickinson and Marlon Brando. However, he still couldn't foresee the final secret, the smell of a legend that would leave the whole world speechless. After enduring enough horror from Angie Dickinson's neglect of her body, Johnny Carson thought he was prepared for the worst possible scenarios. But the appearance of The Godfather opened up a completely different chapter, Marlon Brando. He considered soap something that should be eliminated. In the history of cinema, Marlon Brando was more than just an outstanding actor. Every time he appeared on the silver screen, the entire audience would hold their breath at the powerful charisma radiating from him. Even when wearing just a simple white t-shirt, Brando still made everyone feel intimidated. That was Brando on the screen. But Brando in 1968 sitting as a guest on The Tonight Show was a real olfactory nightmare. He walked onto the stage barefoot, wearing a torn gray t-shirt, baggy jeans, and hair soaked with sweat and stuck to his scalp. The foul stench immediately filled the entire studio, a mixture of accumulated sour sweat, moldy clothes, and the strong smell of raw onions. Brando casually propped his dirty feet up on the sofa, pointing the soles of his filthy feet directly at Johnny Carson's face. According to Johnny, Brando always believed that soap and deodorant were unnatural. He declared he would never touch soap, preferring to bathe with cold water rather than let chemicals wash away his primitive nature. For him, body odor was his personal signature. Every time Brando leaned forward enthusiastically, Johnny had to endure a wave of foul breath mixed with raw onions and the sour smell from his stomach. Even on that gray t-shirt lingered the scent of women, a mixture of perfume and face powder from recent lovers, creating an aroma that was both seductive and nauseating. Throughout the interview, Carson had to hold his breath to maintain his professional smile. The moment Brando stood up and left the chair, Johnny immediately called for staff to spray disinfectant all over the sofa. The stench lingered so strongly that the entire studio had to be ventilated for a long time afterward. Marlon Brando may have changed the face of cinema forever, but for Johnny Carson, this wild king remained the most unforgettable guest, in the heaviest and most haunting way. Bette Davis. Every time she came close, it felt like an olfactory torture of pure horror. When Bette Davis stepped onto the stage of The Tonight Show, the audience was completely enchanted. They worshipped her every sharp glance and her sharp, biting comebacks as the queen without a crown. She exuded a noble, elegant beauty that no jewel could match. However, for Johnny Carson, sitting just an arm's length away from her, this conversation became a real olfactory torture. Bette Davis's body was thick with the smell of years of accumulated cigarette smoke. It was a sour, heavy stench that clung stubbornly to every fiber of her expensive evening gowns. Johnny once described talking to her as like being locked in a basement full of old ashtrays from the 1940s. But something even worse was still to come. To maintain her queen image, Davis would apply thick layers of foundation on her face. Under the burning heat of the studio lights, that mask would begin to melt, releasing a musty smell mixed with long-expired perfume. The biggest challenge came every time Bette spoke. With her theatrical instincts, she would often lean forward and bring her half-smoked cigarette close to Carson's face, sending her breath straight at him. The combination of cigarette smoke, heated face powder, and the sharp sweetness of perfume created a toxic atmosphere that made Carson feel like his lungs were being squeezed every time she opened her mouth. Behind Carson's polite smile was a persistent effort to survive. According to studio staff, he always kept a handkerchief soaked in extremely strong peppermint oil hidden under his desk. He had to use every second when the camera cut away to bring the cloth to his nose and take a quick breath of fresh air before continuing the ordeal. When Bette Davis left the stage, she left behind a legacy that made the entire crew shiver. The chair was so heavily saturated with the smell that the backstage staff had to blow fans directly at the area for 15 minutes and spray liters of air freshener before they dared to clean it. After decades of facing all kinds of smells, Johnny Carson thought he had trained himself to have a steel nose. But he soon realized he was still nothing when faced with another star whose smell was far more horrifying. John Wayne. His breath was a mixture of disinfectant and hundreds of packs of cigarettes. In the minds of millions of viewers, John Wayne was a living epic. He was the Duke, the immortal symbol of American strength, the fearless cowboy who brought justice to the wild frontier. However, when he stepped into Johnny Carson's studio, that epic carried with it an haunting smell that was hard to forget. The first thing that took over Carson's sense of smell was the odor of 5 packs of cigarettes a day. A rough, thick mixture of long-term tobacco smoke blended tightly with the smell of leather from saddles and cowboy boots darkened by time. But hidden behind that smoke was something even more terrifying: the strong chemical and disinfectant scent from his harsh lung cancer treatments. Wayne was destroying himself. Despite countless warnings, he continued to burn his lungs to maintain the image of a proud hero in front of the public. Under the bright studio lights, even the thick layer of makeup couldn't hide his gray, sickly skin. His sweat oozed out, carrying a sour stench that no perfume could cover. It was like standing in front of a beautiful bronze statue, but inside its guts were rotting. Carson later recalled with deep sorrow. When John Wayne left the stage, that great figure gradually disappeared from view, but the lingering scent he left behind was still thick and haunting. Normally, the crew would immediately deodorize to prepare for the next guest, but this time Carson quietly signaled them to stop. Refusing to erase the trace felt like a silent memorial ritual. Carson let the smoke linger in the air as a respectful farewell to a monument that was slowly crumbling. That final pungent, painful, yet still proud smoke was the ending for a man who had melted away in the very fire he himself had lit. If John Wayne represented the collapse of a symbol, then the next woman brought a completely different shock. A horrifying contrast between the eternal beauty of a sex symbol and the reality of a neglected body. Zsa Zsa Gabor. She could make anyone end up in the hospital from fainting. To the public, Zsa Zsa Gabor embodied luxurious glamour with her expensive furs, sparkling diamond jewelry, and signature coquettish voice. However, when she sat down in the leather armchair across from Johnny Carson, reality was the complete opposite. The first smell that hit Johnny's nose was not the scent of roses or luxurious incense, but a confusing mixture. the smell of unrinsed bath milk blended with strong, masculine perfume. Zsa Zsa had a strange habit of using extremely potent men's cologne, believing it gave her an aura of power. But when that scent mixed with the sticky bath milk on her skin, it created a pungent, suffocating smell that was hard to breathe through. Once, a wardrobe assistant nearly fainted when she had to get close to her. The smell from neglected areas of skin mixed with baby powder created such a strong olfactory slap that the assistant staggered and had to run outside for emergency fresh air. The secret behind her polished appearance was hygiene habits that made her servants shudder. Zsa Zsa was famous for her extreme laziness when it came to bathing. She could wear designer outfits worth thousands of dollars, but was too lazy to remove her makeup, causing old layers of powder to pile up into a flaky crust. When Zsa Zsa began moving and talking nonstop about her billionaire marriages, the heat caused the mixture of bath milk, men's cologne, and sweat to start fermenting. A thick wave of air, both sickly sweet and fishy, spread out, forcing Johnny Carson to repeatedly pretend to lean down and check his notes just to avoid the pungent wave. Zsa Zsa Gabor's appearance was an olfactory terror, created by strong men's cologne and sticky bath milk, while the next guest brought Johnny Carson a completely different kind of shock. Richard Burton. He was basically a mobile distillery. In the history of cinema, Richard Burton stood like a monument with the distinct air of British nobility. He not only possessed the golden voice of Shakespearean theater, but was also the powerful other half of screen legend Elizabeth Taylor. However, when he appeared on The Tonight Show, the illusion of a perfect gentleman shattered miserably. The moment Burton stepped onto the stage, the first thing Johnny Carson noticed was a wave of alcohol so strong it could make anyone faint on the spot. Whiskey and vodka seemed to seep out from every pore, soaking into his expensive shirt. Right after that, his eloquent stories about art were replaced by meaningless laughter and broken sentences. His usual sharp intellect was completely drowned in alcohol, making him unable to finish even a simple sentence without stumbling. The sharp eyes that once captivated millions of women now looked dazed, cloudy, and lifeless. Faced with this situation, even a master host like Carson felt helpless. Every time he tried to crack a joke to save the atmosphere, Burton would respond with clumsy gestures or mumbled words. He spoke about alcohol in an affectionate tone as if whispering to a lover, It smells so good. The smell is extremely wonderful." The studio audience went from curious to sympathetic, and finally to whispering, "What's wrong with him?" The smell surrounding Burton at that moment embodied a hopeless and tragic struggle. It was an awkward mix of expensive cologne with the smell of cigarette butts soaked in beer and strong liquor for hours. For Johnny Carson, interviewing Richard Burton was the ultimate test of endurance. He had to maintain his smile and social admiration while his chest fought against the thick, decaying alcoholic fumes. If Richard Burton was a storm of strong liquor that paralyzed the sense of smell, then the next man was a monument cracking under the weight of the smell of disinfectant. Shelley Winters. A sandwich fell out of her musty coat. Shelley Winters was once a true icon of Hollywood, winning 2 prestigious Academy Awards. She was an actress known for powerful roles and endless personal scandals. However, the moment she stepped into the studio for The Tonight Show, the entire set was overcome with a wave of dread. When Shelley sat down in the guest chair, the first thing that assaulted Johnny Carson's sense of smell wasn't ordinary food odor. It was a horrifying combination of old, stale meat sandwich, congealed butter, and dried sauce stains smeared across her expensive silk dress. She seemed so busy living, acting, and storytelling that she had completely forgotten the most basic rules of personal hygiene. The most terrifying part was the luxurious fur coat she wore over her shoulders. After years of never being cleaned, the smell of her body sweat had seeped deep into every strand of fur. Under the intense heat of the studio lights, that odor was baked and spread a scent that backstage staff often described with a shudder as like there's a dead squirrel inside. The highlight of the interview came when a small piece of sandwich, stuck in the folds of her dress, suddenly fell straight into Carson's crystal ashtray. Instead of being embarrassed, Shelley just glanced at it for a second, casually picked it up, brushed off the cigarette ash, and nonchalantly tossed it onto the floor in front of everyone's stunned faces. When she laughed loudly, her teeth were clearly covered with crumbs of bread and bits of tomato still stuck to them. Johnny Carson sat there frozen, his eyes fixed on the now empty ashtray that was still full of horror. Shelley's calm reaction made him realize, for her, no rules of etiquette existed. She lived in her own world, a world where the line between greatness and sloppiness had been completely erased. If Shelley Winters' sloppiness still carried a touch of queenly flair, then the next guest brought a completely different kind of mess, raw, dusty, and so smelly that the entire studio had to open all the doors for ventilation. Kristofferson, a mobile hygiene disaster walking out from under a truck. When Kristofferson walked into the studio for The Tonight Show, he was neither the glamorous country music star nor the romantic hippie that the audience imagined. In front of Johnny Carson and the entire crew stood nothing but a real mobile hygiene disaster. He appeared wearing a full double denim outfit, a denim jacket and dark jeans, but the clothes were stiff and filthy, as if they had been glued to his body for an entire month without ever touching water. The denim was covered in yellowish stains, black machine oil, looking exactly like he had just crawled out from under an old truck in the middle of the desert. The collar had turned yellow from sweat and accumulated road dust. His fingernails were pitch black with dirt, and his calloused palms were sticky with oily sweat. Johnny Carson still remembers that handshake vividly. He once recalled, "His handshake was hot and sticky, making me want to run straight to the bathroom and wash my hands immediately." Under the blazing studio lights, Kristofferson's smell grew stronger and stronger, a mixture of pungent road dust, sour sweat, machine oil, and old cigarette smoke. His hair was greasy and matted to his scalp, and throughout the interview he casually ran his oil-covered hand through it. At the end, Kristofferson even stood up and gave Johnny a big hug, the warm, good old Southern kind of hug. Johnny later said it was the final torture of a goodbye. The smell of road dust and hot sweat clung to his clothes, so thick it was hard to breathe. The moment Kristofferson left the chair, the entire crew secretly opened the back doors of the studio to get some air. The atmosphere inside was as thick as if a truck had just driven through. For Chris, that was his free lifestyle, the spirit of an outlaw with no restraints. For Johnny Carson, it was simply extreme laziness and the most disastrous personal hygiene. But if Kristofferson only made Johnny want to run to the bathroom, the next guest turned the entire studio into something far more chaotic. Walter Matthau. When he shook hands, the whole studio could smell something strange. Walter Matthau was an irreplaceable comic genius. He was the perfect embodiment of the sloppy Oscar Madison in the classic film The Odd Couple. However, when he stepped onto the stage of The Tonight Show, Matthau didn't need to act anymore, because his real life was even sloppier than the character on screen. From the very first handshake with Johnny, the host smelled something very strange. It wasn't just regular sweat, but a thick mixture of racetrack dust, horse manure stuck to his shoe soles, and the musty smell of old paper money. But the real challenge for Carson's sense of smell came from Matthau's habit of eating cheap street food. Because he always ate quickly to save time for horse racing, his breath was constantly filled with the smell of raw onions. Every time he laughed loudly or enthusiastically told a joke, a strong wave of pungent onion smell would hit Carson directly in the face like a biological weapon that made anyone want to step back. Every time Matthau excitedly patted Carson on the shoulder, the poor host felt like his lungs were being squeezed. It was an all-out attack on the sense of smell, the lingering smell of horse manure, oily sweat, and sharp raw onion breath. Johnny had to use every bit of his professionalism as a television star to not pull away, while in reality he was holding his breath until his face turned red just to stay composed. When Walter Matthau left the stage, he didn't just leave behind hearty laughter for the audience, but also a toxic zone that haunted the leather armchair. The studio cleaning crew had to work extremely hard, even joking that they should bring a shovel to clean up the traces of the sloppiest comic genius in history. After more than 3 decades sitting in the legendary host chair of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had seen nearly everything, from the most brilliant moments in film history to the sloppiest, most unkempt sides of its icons. The 10 names mentioned above were not just shining stars. They were the monuments that shaped Hollywood's golden age. However, through Carson's unforgettable olfactory experiences, we realize a very human truth. Behind the flawless makeup, the designer silk dresses, and the gleaming Oscar awards, they were simply ordinary people full of flaws and bizarre habits that no one could have imagined. What do you think about these heavy-smelling secrets of Hollywood legends? Who shocked you the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to hit like plus subscribe so you don't miss more untold stories from Hollywood's golden era in the upcoming videos.